Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming back at you with another APUSH video. This is focusing in on topic 7.8, 1920s cultural and political controversies. This should be our last video on this topic. Now, previously we talked about the economic policies of the presidents that dominated the 1920s. Warren G. Harding and this individual right here, Calvin Coolidge. Now, old Silent Cal is going to be a pretty popular president. He's going to win election in 1924, win re-election in 1924 pretty easily. The economy is booming for the most part. The stock market's going up dramatically. The economy is at its most profitable level than at any other time we'd seen before in American history. And even though Coolidge was devoid of just about all aspects of charisma, Coolidge is going to be a president that certainly would have been able to win another term in office, without a doubt. But he decides not to run. 5 years in the White House, 5.5 years in the White House was seemingly plenty for him, and he was ready to go. So who would fill the void? Who would be the heir apparent to Calvin Coolidge and inherit the popular conservative Republican policies that have dominated that decade? Well, it'll be a man that many Americans had heard of before, and that is going to be Herbert Hoover, as you can see pictured here on the left. Now, you probably remember Herbert Hoover for his role in the Food Administration during World War I, which was wildly successful. We're going to be seeing the federal government able to raise, massive quantities of food to not only help American soldiers in the war, but also to help out millions of civilians in war-torn Western Europe. Hoover had then become Secretary of Commerce, and Hoover was just kind of seen as a guy that whatever job he took, whatever it was, he always seemed to be a success. And even though Hoover had never held elected office in his life before, every job in government had been an appointed position. Republicans are going to flock to him as the guy that can keep the train moving, to keep the good times going, maintaining these similar views about government that his two predecessors had, Harding and Coolidge. Going up against Hoover, as you can see here on the right, will be New York's Alfred Smith. Now, Al Smith is going to be an interesting character. He was kind of like a Harding type, backslapping and good times and not afraid to have a drink, even though it was Prohibition times. And he did have a popular following as the mayor of New York City, and then eventually governor of New York. And so you think, oh, okay, well, sounds like a good candidate, and the Democrats will nominate him, but there's going to be a bit of an issue. Alfred Smith is going to be the first modern major candidate for president that was Catholic. And this is still a major issue with many Americans. Today, it wouldn't be seen as an issue at all. For example, President Biden is Catholic, and nobody thinks twice about it. Nobody cares. But 100 years ago, there was still a lot of issues about that. Most Protestants did not particularly like Catholics. There was a lot of negative associations with them, a lot of negative stereotyping. Remember, at this time of great nativism and, what had been support for the Ku Klux Klan, they were very anti-Catholic. So to nominate a Catholic was a bit of a risk for the Democrats in the 1920s. But the thought was New York was a heavily populated state. Al Smith was a very charismatic, outgoing candidate, and that, he could, pull, some levers to be able to get some support across not just, big cities like New York, but also Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia. And if you tie that in with traditional Southern support for the Democratic Party, that he could maybe pull this off. Not even close. We're going to be seeing, once again, as I've said before, Americans, they typically vote with their pocketbooks. And, in 1928, as far as America was concerned, this was as good as it gets. The economy was humming. People were buying cars and radios and going to baseball games and living life. And, it seemed like the good times would never end. So why rock the boat? The Republican Party had been the the party that had been associated with these great economic times. Why jump ship now? And to give you a sense of the beatdown that Hoover's going to be putting on Al Smith, take a look at this map here. This is even going to break down a lot of the traditional lines of the Democrats and the Republicans dating all the way back to the Civil War. We'll see that broken down. Now, note, the vast majority of Smith's support is going to be in the Deep South, although he'll get Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But Al Smith can't even get his home state of New York, which is, pretty astounding. So, an unbelievably strong economy that's associated with Hoover's party. And remember, Hoover's part of that Harding and Coolidge administration, so he gets credit for that. He's the Secretary of Commerce, for goodness sakes. So he gets a lot of that credit. And the fact that Al Smith was a Catholic at a time where, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, that didn't help as well. So Hoover wins and wins big. And as far as most Americans were concerned, this is just going to be continuation of the same. Nothing's going to change. The economy is going to keep on rolling into the 1930s. The good times may never end. Little did people think that those good times are going to end pretty darn soon. But we'll get to that another time. To round out taking a look at today, we're going to be taking a look at the emerging Harlem Renaissance that's going to be defining, black culture in the 1920s. Now, previously we've talked about how lives for African Americans in many cases were changing and changing quite dramatically. We saw, starting with World War I, the emergence of that Great Migration, where thousands of black Americans are going to leave the rural South, attempt to leave, Jim Crow segregation behind, move to northern cities like New York and Chicago and Philly and Detroit and Cincinnati to get these factory jobs. And even though this will lead to some, pretty nasty clashes with whites, blacks are not going anywhere. Blacks have now found a new home in these northern cities. And there will be more opportunities, despite the many challenges of living in the North, despite the rampant racism that still existed in the North. There was still more opportunity in northern urban areas than in southern rural areas. I mean, southern rural areas were still dealing with issues of tenant farming, sharecropping, and stuff like that. So this is going to be attractive, northern cities, for many black Americans. And because of racism, and not Jim Crow segregation, but let's be honest, de facto segregation nonetheless, you're going to start to see black communities popping up in some of these big cities. And the most famous of them all is going to be Harlem in New York City. Now, you can see in this painting right here that you're talking about neighborhoods emerging that are urban and overwhelmingly dominated by African Americans. And so when you live in large numbers in a pretty dense space, you're going to start to really define your values as an ethnicity in that kind of an environment. And in many respects, it's going to be, it's a breeding ground to really, 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 define and, encapsulate what it means to be black in America in the 1920s. So you're going to see this serve as a catalyst for some just fantastic writing and music coming from African Americans in the 1920s. And part of this is going to be in the form of poetry. As you can see here pictured, you see Langston Hughes, certainly one of the most well-regarded Harlem Renaissance poets. Like other, Harlem Renaissance era writers like Claude McKay and Zora Neale Hurston, amongst others, the main topic for many of Langston Hughes's poems are what it means to be black. The joy, the pride of being black, which is also going to be something that's going to be very powerful and for many black Americans new in the 1920s. If you're living in a black community, a black neighborhood, you're not looking over your shoulder. You're not, worried about, am I white enough? Am I fitting in with waspish culture? You're living amongst other people with the same ethnic background, the same values, the same culture, and you can be yourself and be proud to be who you are. And so a lot of the writing by Hughes and many other writers of the Harlem Renaissance is promoting that sense of black pride. But it's also, though, focusing in on the challenges of being black in America in the 1920s. The fact that racism still is a major, major problem. That there is de facto segregation in all areas of American life, North and South. The idea of finding that equality and being able at the same time, being able to be proud of who you are and the community you represent are going to be these very important topics. If you ever get a chance, I recommend reading the poem I Too by Langston Hughes, which really talks about the idea of living in a society now as a black person where you are segregated, where you tend to be relegated and marginalized, but still with a sense of optimism that things will change in the future, and that you don't have to change who you are. You don't have to give up your identity as being black in a future where Americans will accept you as a black person. So, it's a really good poem. If you get a chance, it's very, very short, really good poem. Check it out if you get a chance. Now, besides that, music is also going to be a defining part of the Harlem Renaissance arts movement, including and most in particular jazz. Prior to this, you had a lot of fans of ragtime that was still pretty popular, but by the time we get to the 1920s, we were seeing influences from New Orleans and Chicago and St. Louis coming together to promote jazz music, which is going to be very up tempo. A lot of it is going to be horn and saxophone driven, although Duke, you can see here Duke Ellington here on the left is going to be with the piano. Louis Armstrong, a famous trumpeter, and so you're going to start to see that black music, all right, jazz, as coming from the black community, is not going to only just define music of the black community, but it's going to become mainstreamed. And this is going to be one of many examples into the future. In the 20s, it's jazz. It's 50s, it's rock and roll. In 80s, it's rap music. Of music that comes from the black community to become embraced mainstream. And we see music as one of those things that will, over time, unify more and more Americans across racial lines. But somebody that was not particularly interested in crossing racial lines and unifying people based on, regardless of race, will be Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey is an interesting character. We've talked in the past about, civil rights leaders of the past, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, Booker T. Washington. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois is still around. He's still a very big, figure. But remember, Du Bois is talking about equality in America for black Americans. The idea of if you live in America as a black person, you should be able to enjoy all the same rights and all the same privileges as a white person. But in the case of Marcus Garvey, he's representing black Americans who have become soured on optimism of bringing whites and blacks together and truly getting equality. Marcus Garvey was what you would consider to be a black nationalist who believed that in order for black Americans to get any real equality, you have to live in a society without white people. You have to live in a society with only black people. And Garvey's going to be promoting what he calls the Back to Africa movement. The idea of if you go to Africa, where the vast majority of people are black, you're not going to have those same issues with racism and discrimination and segregation and stuff like that. And so he's going to have a bit of a movement in New York City, with this. But unfortunately, Garvey's efforts have a lot of criticism because Garvey was not somebody that, viewed race as something that was anything more than a sense of who you are. In other words, let me kind of explain this. Marcus Garvey was a racial purist. He believed that, black people that had white ancestors were not truly black. And black people need to be with other, quote-unquote, true black people. And in many respects, he modeled many of the same attitudes as white Klansmen. In fact, he was friends with many white Klansmen because they both had the shared goals of creating these separate societies based purely on race. Now, at the end of the day, Garvey's plan is going to go up in smoke. He's going to be convicted of defrauding his customers, and he'll never actually get the Back to Africa movement going. But in the sense of promoting black pride, Garvey is going to be a significant force during this time period. We'll see you next time. Bye.